Thank you so much. And thank you for
Yeah.
your teaching in basketball. So I learned many things and do appreciate that very much. Sharing screen here, I was invited to share a topic that would be to some degree affecting the times in which we live. And I'm hearing questions from our believers. I'm hearing, is COVID-19 a judgment of God on the human race? Is it a sign of the end? Does Bible prophecy speak about it? Are lockdowns an assault on religious freedom? And I thought it might be helpful just to consider these questions just a little bit from the Word of God. So, my topic today is what the Bible has to say about contagious disease like COVID-19. Now, first of all, let me be clear that COVID-19 is not apocalyptic in scale at this point. It's not a sign of the end in some apocalyptic sense. The Spanish flu killed some 50 to 100 million people out of 2 billion in the world. The Black Plague, estimated, killed about 75 million out of 500 million in the world, 1 out of 3 in parts of Europe. By comparison, COVID-19 has so far resulted in somewhat less than 900,000 deaths out of 7.8 billion. Every one of those deaths is a tragedy. It has certainly been a huge challenge, and many of you have faced that in your own churches, but apocalyptic in scale compared to other things that have happened, I would say not. Biblical evidence about contagious disease. The Old Testament word for it, the Hebrew, is dever, and that word occurs something like 50 times in the Old Testament. And basically, contagious disease is a consequence of Israel's unfaithfulness. In other words, if Israel was faithful to God and fully followed him in all his ways, God would protect them from some things that he cannot under the circumstances. The loss of God's protection often happened. In particular, that loss of protection was invasion, because the most serious cause of contagious disease was a siege, where you'd have an enemy power would come in and they would fight with Israel. And without God's protection, Israel would lose the fight and they would go back into the walls of the city. And cooped up in the city, it would result in sword, famine, pestilence, and death. That after the sword would come the famine, and as the people are starving inside the siege, then comes pestilence, and then comes death. So the biblical evidence in the Old Testament is that it is a consequence of human rebellion that we have things like contagious disease. In the New Testament, in the Greek, the words are much rarer. The Greek word for contagious disease is loimos, but there's another word, thanatos, which normally means death, that is used in the Septuagint to translate the Hebrew dever. So the term death and the term contagious disease has been mingled in the Greek language. In Luke 21, Jesus associates contagious disease with the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. In Matthew 24, there's a question mark because some manuscripts have loimos and some do not. But regardless of it, what Jesus is saying is that contagious disease is the beginning of sorrows. It's not a sign of the end, but it's part of the human condition as a result of sin. And perhaps almost humorously, in Acts 24:5, the spokesperson for the priests before the governor of Syria, Palestine, says regarding Paul, he is such a pest, using the very word for contagious disease. So Jesus, on the Mount of Olives in Luke 21, did not see contagious disease as a sign of the end. He did speak about it as something that was part of the whole human condition as a result of sin. But Jesus did associate something else with the end times. In Luke 21, 25, and 26, Jesus says panic is actually a sign of the end. And I wonder if we're not experiencing as much of that as of the former. Luke 21, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on earth distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So for Jesus, there would be a particular psychological condition that would come just before his return. Contagious disease might be associated with the final events, but is not uniquely a sign of that end. Going to the other New Testament word, thanatos, it is a word that normally means death, but because of its repeated use to translate the Hebrew word for contagious disease, it can have the meaning of contagious disease in the New Testament. You simply have to read the context to see which meaning is intended. So one place is Revelation 2:23. It's speaking of the church of Thyatira, and it mentions contagious disease, perhaps in a spiritual sense, is a reality in the church of Thyatira, an event in past history. Revelation 6:8, it's part of the fourth seal, where you have the rider on the pale horse. And once again, we've understood that passage to be things general to human experience, not a sign of the end. The one text in the entire Bible that may be particularly connecting contagious disease with the events of the very end is Revelation 18:8. And in this text, it's associated with the end time. This is the only place where you have that. For this reason, Babylon's plagues will come in a single day: death, pestilence, there's that word, mourning, and famine. And she will be burned up with fire. Now, the translators, if you go to the major translations, are divided about 50-50. Should you translate death or pestilence here? So there's even some question here, but I would suggest that one of the typical ways you deal with pestilence in ancient times is that when a person dies, the body is immediately burned up so that the contagion will not spread from the dead body. So I would suggest here pestilence is the correct understanding, that Babylon receives plagues including pestilence, mourning, and famine, and in the end, Babylon is burned up with fire. So conclusions: the pandemic is not a sign of the end, but it will accompany the end. It is part of the things that happen as a result of human sin. It's not a direct punishment from God, but it is a consequence of the human condition. It's a consequence of human rebellion against the covenant. So the final question: are lockdowns an assault on religious freedom? Let's explore biblical lockdowns for a little bit of guidance here. The Bible actually speaks of social distancing. When it comes to leprosy, it says that person shall cry out, unclean, unclean, and his dwelling shall be outside the camp. In the first 44 verses, Leviticus 13, there are elaborate diagnostic procedures for knowing whether you have leprosy or not. And there's even 7 to 14-day quarantines for those who are suspected of leprosy or for those who report that they have been cured. They nevertheless go into quarantine. Numbers 5, Lord spake unto Moses, saying, command the children of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper. Social distancing. Numbers 12:14, Miriam, let her be shut outside the camp 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again. So social distancing is not contrary to the scriptures. It is one of the ways in which the Bible dealt with social distancing. But there's two differences in the biblical situation. First of all, in the Bible, it's the infected that are isolated, not the healthy. That's different than what we're doing today. And the Israelites were dealing with observable physical symptoms. One of the real problems with coronavirus is the most dangerous people may be the ones that don't even know they have it. And in that situation, social distancing has expanded far beyond the biblical limits of it. Is there a biblical solution? Does the Bible offer any counsel for the situation we face today? I believe there is some. First of all, the Bible would suggest find a better way to diagnose. The testing that we now have is not adequate to truly deal with the situation, to truly identify all those who are a danger to the larger society. So find a better way to diagnose. When you've done that, isolate the infected and let the others go back to normal life. Until then, the Bible would suggest cooperate with legitimate authority. And here I think of the Apostle Paul, who pondered the very kinds of situations we're facing today and had the following counsel: let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. For he, the legitimate ruler, is God's servant for your good. I recognize that there are limits to legitimacy of governmental authority. I realize there's a tension between religious liberty and public health. But in that tension, the Bible encourages us as far as possible to be subject to the governing authorities and cooperative with our communities, that they may not look at us as pests, as Paul once was. God bless you, and thank you for these moments and your attention.